Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of the Cyberman Show. I'm back after a break, and today we have something new on compliance. You might remember my good old friend Vishwameet. We spoke about data security a while back with him, and he's back again with the NIS2 Directive. So, Vishwameet, welcome back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prashant. Pleasure to be back again.
Yeah, so Vishwamit and I were talking about NIS2, and he thought, it will be great if we can explain NIS2 with his experience on working directly with NIS2. So Vishwamit, I'm going to hand it over to you. Let's take the audience through whatever you have prepared.
Perfect, perfect. No, thank you so much. As I said, Prashant, it's phenomenal. It's an absolute pleasure to be back again on the Cyberman Show with the ultimate Cyberman, I should say. So what we'll just share my screen because I'll rather have that as our pivot,
Sure.
so that we kind of just revolve around that as um, what we'll be talking about on NIS2. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Is that visible?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Great. So NIS2, what I thought was for your viewers and listeners' perspective, it'll be good to have a discussion around what this is all about. How does this asks us as individual and the organizations to level up their cybersecurity game? By the way, the directive right now is just enforceable in the aspects that the member countries in the European Union have to take this as the guideline and develop their own laws, which would then come into effect by 17th October 2024. So in terms of what we'll be covering as the agenda for this one, would be just a bit of a brief introduction for the directive as such. Just a bit of a timeline view of how this has evolved. This is not new, by the way, for the European Union. They used to have NIS as the previous directive, and then they upgraded to the next version, which they are calling as NIS2, which is National Information Security 2 Directive. Just the scope and objectives of this, how does this align to cybersecurity as a whole? Some of the improvements and the changes, the novelties that it introduces from NIS to this new one. And then there is this sectoral capability that it has got. I've seen this for the first time, that one of the directives or the laws is getting into very specific details of sectors. So they have categorized this directive to be applicable to essential and important, and that's the entity categorization that we'll be talking about in that slide.
Oh,
And
okay.
then the crux, which is Article 21 and 22, which is the primary objectives which we could figure out, or which I could figure out rather, would be applicable to the organizations and thus individuals who are working within those organizations. And therefore, what are the opportunities for us as individuals while this directive is still getting enforced and becoming law, and the organizations, both the SI, consulting, and possibly product organizations, the kind of opportunities that this whole thing throws. This is pretty much in line with what you thought, Prashant.
Yes. So I have a question, Vishwamit, which is why is it called a directive, not a compliance? Or is it a compliance and directive is the term that they use? Is it a
It's going to
mandate?
become, yeah, sorry.
So is it a mandate that every organization who's part of the European Union has to have, or it's like best practice?
So it's called directive because it is right now um, taken up by the European Union countries and interpreted to come out with their own interpretations as laws.
Oh, okay.
And once that's a law with those countries, this becomes the nucleus of that, and then those laws would be complied against.
Oh, okay. So it's like ISO 27001, if I'm getting this right, which becomes the base for doing everything in cybersecurity from compliance perspective. Something similar to that?
Something similar, I would say, but that's more like not a union directive, or so to say, a national directive, or uh, something that has got a mandatory value for the countries to abide by. That's more like an industry
Hmm.
kind of guideline with which the ISMS gets implemented. This
Sure.
would definitely be turned into laws, different kinds of laws. So
Hmm.
any country who is a part of the European Union would have a law which is based on this, and then all of those entities that we'll be talking about in the
Sure.
further slides would have to abide by that.
So it becomes a template essentially, right?
Absolutely. This is like
Got it.
the template with which everybody has to work out their laws by, I think, 17th October
Hmm.
2024.
Okay. And so there is already GDPR, which we spoke about, right, earlier. So GDPR focuses specifically on data privacy, data security. This is a generic cybersecurity best practice recommendations. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
it's
Perfect.
it has got wider ramifications.
Got it. Thank you. Back to you.
Perfect. So, just in a nutshell, about 46 articles into this, a lot of cybersecurity capability enhancement built up that's been mentioned out in a lot of these chapters that are being talked about. The idea is for the European Union as such to come out with a cyber infrastructure which is more secure and robust. And this is European Union because they also talk about creating a kind of a cooperation, and they call it Cyclone. There is a abbreviation, a full form for that as well, EU Cyclone, which they would be working with to make sure that each of those countries contribute to that robust and secure cyber infrastructure. As for any of the cybersecurity directive, the idea is to just protect the countries and eventually the entities and the organizations against the cyber threat. As I said, this has to be coming into effect as laws from those different countries by 17th October 2024, and then thereafter the private and the public entities have to comply against those laws. We'll be concentrating majorly on Chapter 4 because that has the most of the meat as far as this directive is concerned. So this is Chapter 4, which is cybersecurity, risk management measures, and reporting obligations, basically. So Article 20 to 25 is what then would be converted into different kinds of controls, and then thereafter being converted into the services, solutions, and the products that we could be implementing, consulting with, probably integrating as well.
Got it. Okay. So this, I believe, will be equivalent to something in US also, right? So US has the, I'm sure US has a lot of organizations like CISA. There's of course, FBI. They keep putting up regulations and advisories. Not FBI doesn't do regulations, but CISA definitely does advices and recommendation. And they have multiple regulations. Every state has some regulations also. So NIS2 is more from Europe. It's an equivalent of multiple regulations that exist at both federal and state level in US, right?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, this is more structured in the way that it has got a bit of a federal nature, and then there is bit of independence given to individual countries to interpret and come out with their own laws on this directive. So in a
Yeah.
way, you could think of US states possibly
Hmm.
having an agency like
Yes.
CISA, which just gives them some template to follow and then work out their
Yeah.
own interpretations as well. So quickly on the timeline, I think or I should say, this is how it's been reflected out. July 2016 is when this came into effect, which is the first version, which I call it now, I call as NIS 1 or NIS. May 2018 there was this deadline for transposition of NIS1 into different laws. And then thereafter, those laws were the ones that the countries were abiding by and complying to. Now, December 2020, they believe that NIS1 needs to be improved upon. And the major improvement, as I talked about, has to have the sectoral capabilities as well, has to have vertical capabilities. So cybersecurity in healthcare is different than cybersecurity in banking. So they thought of having NIS2, which was December 2020, and December 2022, the NIS2 directive got published, which is at the European Union level. Yeah, right now, somewhere in between that, we're close to like 11 more months, and we'll have the transposition into laws of the NIS2 directive now.
Sure. By the way, I'm impressed with the timeline, considering it all happened between European Union, so many countries to come together and build the or agree on the second version. Knowing that version 1 came out in 2016, another 5-6 years, they all agreed that it needs a change. It has to be flavored for a particular industry. Very impressive, considering that it's all federal.
Yeah, I mean, and with the regulations, I think this is more like a usual practice that most of the regions should follow, because the attack surfaces change. It's so dynamic. The cyber threats change. A lot of different things come up which were not thought about in the previous directives. I think this is a precedent that the other regions could follow. As you said,
Absolutely.
it's very impressive for sure.
Yeah.
So it's going to be covering around 160,000 entities. And the types is around 67, and I'm going to be talking about those entities. So
Sure.
it's going to be in the in further slide. With that, let me just quickly get you through the scope and objectives, majorly highlighted on the left-hand side. If you see in the slide, obviously this is NIS1 plus. It has got more capabilities as such. Verticalization or sectoral inputs is another one that it has got as an input. Supply chain risks, and these supply chain risks are not necessarily the code supply chain risk that we're talking about. It's more to do with the third-party vendors, the processor controller kind of a relationship. Those risks come into this as well. As I said, it covers around 67 total entities. There is a possible extensibility, the audits, the attestation capability it provides, with ENISA being the agency in European Union. So there are possible extensible capabilities as well. And at the end of it, I think it has got risk-oriented approach with which it works out. So in a nutshell, what it demands is a risk-oriented approach, and it includes all essential and digital providers, digital service providers, online marketplaces, search engines, and cloud computing services. I mean, this is at a broader level that it has, and then I'll talk about the other things as well. It applies to both public and private entities, essential services which have been provided by these public and private entities. Most of the industries that these essential services are basically the healthcare, energy, transport, water, digital infrastructure, and banking. Entities as such would be divided, the ones that we talked about on the previous slide, divided into two categories. One is the essential entities, and the other one is the important entities. And this may be subjected to different supervisory regimes depending on how the interpretation happens with the different countries and their laws that come up. The directive expands the scope of the previous rules by adding new sectors. And the most important thing that directive looks into is the degree of digitalization and interconnectedness. So degree of digitalization and interconnectedness of that particular entity or the type of entity. So that's a very important caveat there. And then the second one that it looks into is how crucial they are for the economy and the society. So both economy and society.
That's very impressive. Contextualizing based on the
Exactly.
change in the environment, the current environment, especially last four
Very
or five
true.
years, right? One thing I've noticed, and I would cover this in a later podcast. So NISA came up with their threat report, which they do on a quarterly, yearly basis, uh, depending on what's happening in European Union. And I noticed that in their reporting, they have gone very deeply into the sector part. Okay, so in previous reports, I rarely saw mention of attacks on particular sector, supply chain risk. All these things are getting added into their reporting. So I believe they are all working together. So
Yes.
while NISA is tracking threats based on industries, vertical, geos in European Union, the people who are behind legislations and laws, they are updating this in a much real, in a better timeline compared to what it was. So very, very good initiative, I think.
Yeah. And beyond those important essential, there is a bit of a clear size threshold rule as well. And that threshold rule impacts what gets defined as essential and what gets defined as important. I've got a slide on that. So how
Sure.
this whole thing works out.
Hmm.
So just on that, all medium and large sized companies in the selected sectors that we talked about are in the scope of this directive.
So, Vishnu, I have a question. So it says
Mhm.
online marketplaces, search engine. So does it apply to international companies like Google? It's a search engine that's used widely in Europe. So which means a company like Google, I think they're headquartered out of Ireland or whatever. If they're headquartered out of Ireland, I'm sure they have to comply. But let's take another example: Microsoft, Binge, another search engine, and which are Microsoft is a US-based entity, so they also have to comply to NIS2 because they are present in the region.
Logically, yes, it's a
Yes,
directive. I'm sure once the laws are out, we
mm,
will come to know that it applies.
of course.
Logically, as I said, yes. GDPR applies to a lot of entities which are not present in European
Yes.
Union by only um, uh, the subject matter of having
Mm,
the data for the European Union consumers and customers. So
yeah. Yeah.
logically,
So
yes, but
logically, yes. Yes. We'll see.
it'll be seen when
Yeah.
the interpretation happens in the laws.
Okay.
At the same time, just carrying forward this whole conversation, um, this whole directive leaves the discretion to the states to identify smaller entities with higher security risk profile. So there could be exceptions applied in what we defined as medium and large sized companies or entities. So if there is a smaller entity which has got a greater national significance or digital interconnectedness is more, it could then be put into essential or important entity and gets covered into this directive. So there are exceptions applied as well. It also addresses security of supply chains, as I discussed, the supplier relationship by requiring the individual companies to address cybersecurity risks in the supply chains and the supplier relationships. At European level, the directive strengthens the supply chain cybersecurity for key information and communication technologies. The member states, in cooperation with the Commission and NISA, may carry out union-level coordinated security risk assessments of critical supply chains, the one that I talked about, the extensibility bit of it. Um, just building on what they did for cybersecurity of 5G networks. So I think NISA is also doing similar kind of activities to make sure that the cybersecurity of 5G networks is being top notch in terms of carrying out the risk assessments. Um, Sectors of high criticality, just to give you a sense, it includes energy, it includes electricity, HVAC, direct heating and cooling, oil and gas, and hydrogen. It includes transport, which is air, rail, water, and road. Then it includes banking, financial market infrastructures, It also includes health, which will have the manufacturing of pharmaceutical products, including vaccines now with what COVID has done for us.
Yeah.
Drinking water, wastewater management, and the
Oh,
digital infrastructure. Now, digital infrastructure is something which is um, very important, significant, and very interesting as well. So within the digital infrastructure, a lot of service providers get included. So internet exchange points, the DNS service providers, the TLDs, the cloud computing service providers, the data centers, so on and so forth. I've got a slide on that as well. And then the ICT management. So this is where MSSPs would come in, MSPs come in as well.
okay.
Both of them, they would be impacted by this. So most of the companies that we have working in European region, the biggest SIs in an Indian region would get included into this. And public administration and space, that also gets included. There are a few other critical sectors as well, like postal courier services, waste management, chemicals, food, um, motor vehicles, trailers, so on and so forth. So wider ramifications, different kinds of sectors, everything that has got that interconnected nets, the digital interconnectedness, and the importance to the economy and society. I think all of that gets included into this scope of NIS2.
Yeah, I mean, as long as a business uses IT, they are they have to comply, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So here, what's the improvement in terms of NIS1 and NIS2? There is a bit of increase on the sectoral scope. I think in NIS1, they used to have around 30 entities, and in NIS2, it's about 67 entities in total. So that's the whole increase that has happened, and it is to do with both the kinds that we talked about, which is essential as well as important. The hardening expectations have changed a lot, which is to do with both cyber resilience, backup, recovery capabilities, and incident response and planning and execution. All of those have changed in NIS2 and made better, if I could say so. The expansions on sanctions have increased, and these sanctions would get their own interpretations in laws. And it'll be interesting to see how the individual countries come out with what kind of sanctions can they put in on those entities, and how does that apply to a foreign entity as such, and how would the law apply to those foreign entities. So it'll be interesting to see. As I said, this is what I talked about, the cyclone part of it. Interestingly, they call it cyclone. So EU cyber crisis cooperation is being increased to make sure that all of those countries are collaborating, cooperating, communicating to make sure that they've got a better cyber infrastructure. Now, quickly onto the entity categorization, and this is where how this works out and how the interpretation to essential and important works out. So all of those sectors that I talked about have been represented on the left-hand box. Some of these are very critical. The other ones are critical to the European Union and thereby the countries as well. These are different kinds of sectoral representation that we have on the left-hand box. And then what's large is being represented out here. So any critical or very critical having more than 250 employees and an annual turnover of about 50 million euros, or a balance sheet total of 43 million euros is represented or is being marked as essential. And then anything which is lesser than that, which is like 50 or fewer than 250 employees, annual turnover not exceeding 50 million euros, or a balance sheet not exceeding 43 million euros, are important. And then, as I said, there are exceptions that could be applied here. Just
So let
quick
me understand
representation.
this clearly.
Mhm.
So it's the size of the organization, including the annual turnover, which decides if it's essential or important, right?
Exactly.
Okay. And then, of
Exactly.
course, there's a further categorization on type of business, which is critical or very critical. So, example, uh, water treatment plan. It's wastewater, which is what the entity refers to, would fall into very critical. And depending on the size of the entity. Let's say there is a company which is in uh, Ireland, is small. It has less than 250 employees, so it would be essential. But a similar company of, which is into wastewater, which is out of, let's say, Sweden, and has less than 50 employee, it can be categorized as important. Is that correct?
Absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely.
perfect.
Unless and of course, Article 3.1 applies to any of them. So there are exceptions that could be put in to important entity as an essential entity because of certain sort of closeness to the national um, uh, capabilities, or for that matter, the digital interconnectedness, as I talked about, or some kind of economic considerations for that entity as well. So there are exceptions that get applied, which are represented out in the Article 3.1.
Sure.
So that's how this gets defined. And at the end of it, what we need to remember is if it's essential or it's important, the NIS2 directive has got different kinds of imperatives for those. And majorly those, if breached, are related to what would be the penalty and fine. So for large, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 10 mil or 2%, and for important, it's about 1.4 mil, and I think 7%. And
Yeah.
then like we could
So
check that
essentially,
out
there is a
once.
fine depending on how much they can pay.
Exactly, exactly, and that's directly correlated to what they have got in terms of balance
Yeah.
sheets as well. So,
Yeah.
um,
What
so
I can
the,
definitely, of course, this is a directive. What I can see is cybersecurity getting everywhere, right? So our jobs will
absolutely.
get important, Mm, like every year, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, you always need a lock. If you've got something which is important, something which is um, to be taken care of. In old adage, people had a lock, and we
Yeah.
need cybersecurity. So, yep. Okay, quickly, the technical purview. I'm not going to be naming all of these. We discussed about these,
Sure.
and these would have some technical requirements. So apart from the technical entities, apart from the entities that we talked about in the previous slide, this is more to do with the technical service providers, which would also be getting covered through this directive.
Okay.
And there
So
are
I'll
some
I'll take a
technical.
step back. So I have
Mhm.
entities there. Okay. How is it tying to entities?
The entity thereby would have a service provider, which would possibly be a combination of this, right? In case the breach happens through a service provider or on a service provider, the service provider is then responsible. But if the entity is getting breached, the entity gets responsibility as well. The breakup of both, in case both of them have got certain sort of shared responsibility in terms of the breach or any kind of cybersecurity incident for that matter, is still to be worked out. I haven't seen that in detail into the publication right now. Possibly when we have the laws coming out, we might see what is the percentage or how does that get delineated. But my thought process is, because most of these entities would be using this, and possibly getting breached on one of these as their
Of
service
course. Yeah.
provider.
This is their supply chain, right? One of the
Exactly,
most of
that's their
them. Yes.
supply chain. So that delineation of how would the fines and penalties would be affected and would be worked out, I haven't seen that. Maybe
Sure.
my lack of knowledge, but my gut is that this may get interpreted into the laws when those come out on 17th October next year.
Okay.
Great. Quickly, this is the meat of it. This is how this gets applied. This is Article 21. These are different kinds of cybersecurity ramifications or cybersecurity capabilities, I shouldn't say ramifications, which would need to be made more robust. Um, and in there lies the opportunities for organizations and individuals as well. So what you see here, which is the representation out here, is Article 21, and then Article 22 is basically the coordination that could be done out of. I'm sorry, I'm getting. Just give me a minute. Are you seeing anything on the screen? Oh, okay,
Yeah,
now it's good.
it's gone. Yes.
Okay. So quickly on that. That's Article 21 and that's Article 22. Now, policies, I mean, these are just policies that we have. That's what it subscribes. It makes the entities to subscribe basically the directive. And then we've got incident handling procedures. This is incident response, planning and execution.
Yeah.
Business continuity gets into the mix as well, which is backup
Yeah.
management, disaster recovery, and crisis management. Supply chain security, again, as we talked
Yeah.
about the security related aspects, the relationships between each entity and its direct suppliers and service organizations. How this would be worked out is through the vulnerabilities that are specific to each of the direct suppliers and
Okay.
service providers. That's the relationship between the entity and the supplier, basically, or the processor and the controller, or the controller or the processor. The overall quality of products and cybersecurity practices would also be a consideration while looking at this supply chain security as such.
Yeah, because of my product background, and because I work,
Exactly.
I see tons of requirement coming in, right? It's going
Absolutely.
to impact the cybersecurity business for sure.
Absolutely.
What is great is they have added supply chain security. Other things are standard, I think.
Yeah,
Most of them I've seen are there in other regulations, right?
correct.
Right. So
Yeah, and
best practices, but supply chain security is pretty good.
yeah, network information systems, it's acquisition,
Yeah.
development, and maintenance, including the vulnerability handling policies and procedures. To assess the effectiveness of cybersecurity risk management measures is what it gets covered there as well.
Yeah.
And then cybersecurity hygiene, which is more to do with cybersecurity training, um, those practices around that. The big one on the encryption side, the cryptographic practices of the organization, the policies and procedures there, and the access control, which is around the human resources security and possibly identities as well now, which are not human resources, the non-carbon entities or identities, as they say. And then use of multi-factor authentication, which is secured voice, video, and text communications, um, emergency communication, all of those aspects to be taken care of by the multi-factor authentication.
Okay.
As I said, Article 22, which is reflected out here, it's kind of risk assessment that gets done um, with the cooperation group. I'm sure that's gonna get formed, or it is already in process to be getting formed, along with a commission and NISA, that they would carry out the coordinated security risk assessments of specific ICT services and ICT systems that are there in these supply chains. They take into account the technical and where relevant non-technical risk factors as well. So both the kinds of factors that get into consideration. So all in all, this is where a lot of mapping would happen, whether it's the consulting side of it, whether it's the implementation side of it, and that's where I think the organizations would have a role to play and the individuals. I've got next slide, which I thought would make a lot of sense to just give you the opportunities in my eyes, and these may
Yeah.
not be very exhaustive, so to say. I think there is huge impetus right now to do a bit of consulting around gap analysis of what controls are needed, kind of enabling technologies which would be needed. So new tools that could come into the picture with those consulting assignments. Service integrations would be an offshoot of those consulting capabilities or consulting assignments that the organization take. So all kinds of tools, technologies, and frameworks that could come in. The interesting one would be the third point. I think the sectoral view would ask the service organizations to, and consulting organizations for that matter, to come out with very specific service solution offerings which are um, defined for essential and important entities. There could be some small changes done for each of those verticals, which then could be converted into what the offerings are. And obviously, it would lead the OEMs to develop new product feature sets,
Yes,
which
of
are for
course.
that compliance and risk mitigation for sure.
Mm.
Um,
So typically, whenever I've dealt with compliance and I see consultants coming in, they make their own checklist based on their understanding,
yeah,
and these checklists will be followed by a gap analysis, manual, or automated, or maybe hybrid mode, and then it gets to SIs, which they release. They work on those RFPs launched by customers, and then implementation of whatever is missing or was reported in the gaps. And then, of course, while that happens, OEMs, product makers, they come up with vertical solutions. So going back to the same example, water management company
yeah,
that is based on, let's say, Industry 4.0 principles, connected infrastructure. So how do you secure that? So companies would work with these companies building solutions for water treatment, and working at either the IT level or the OT level to build solutions. So that's pretty good. I think it would definitely increase the collaboration between vendors of various types. So, example, working more closely with companies, Siemens, for example,
yeah.
Honeywell, Rockwell Automation, and then, of course, the cybersecurity companies, Palo Alto, Microsoft. So, all the big companies will definitely build more common solutions. Yeah, so makes sense. This is a great list.
Yeah, and as you rightly pointed out, I mean, one thing would lead to the other. I see this as basically what's been followed for the other regulations. When GDPR came into effect, everybody got into the gap analysis. Similarly, NIS2 would lead to people figuring out what gaps exist and then trying to work out new security controls for those gaps.
Yeah, I still remember, you and I, we started on the data security cryptography side. I thought that was a niche field, and
Yeah,
GDPR came and it sparked, you know, uh, interest in cryptography, data encryption. That industry is a large industry now, right? It's getting revived with data security, DSPM, data governance platform. So that's pretty good. So I'm sure Nest will again fuel something.
absolutely, absolutely. So for individuals, I think the idea is there would be project teams formed for now, because there isn't a country specific regulation. I think the idea is to just understand this as a broad directive and figure out what's the nucleus on which these country specific regulations would be formed. They could
Yeah,
be part of those project teams, which then would do all of those things which are on the left hand side. So
yeah. Hmm.
get ahead, just work this out, read the regulation. There are
Hmm.
lots of information splintered all across. The text of the regulation is also good. It is not the best of the languages, as I say legally.
Yeah,
It becomes difficult, but there are lots of
yeah.
white papers
Hmm.
now which are there. So get ahead on that. There will be continuous operations. And once we are through the gap analysis, once the controls are in place, the evolution happens, self-attestation, audits, these could be possible avenues for people to get in. Understanding of the regulation
Yeah.
is a bare necessity to carry out any kind of audit or a
Yeah,
self-attestation.
so
So
more work if you are an auditor or
yeah,
a legal officer.
absolutely. And legal advisors, of
Yeah, legal
course,
advisor, of
because
course. Yes.
this interpretation of the laws, from the directive or after the laws are there, the legal advisors would definitely be there. And then because this has got, and that's something which I couldn't touch in the previous slides, I think the reporting timelines for a breach have changed by this
Oh,
directive.
okay.
Um, so any incident happening is 24 hours. Any kind of breach happening is 72 hours, and
Oh,
then
okay.
30 days is the full report
Oh,
that needs
wow.
to be published.
Stringent
Um,
timeline, just like US. I
yeah,
don't think
so
in US they mandated 30-day of incident reporting timeline. When full analysis for a large scale breach can hardly be done in 30 days, right?
yeah,
In all
so
reality. Uh,
yeah, possibly it'll be interesting to look at how
yeah.
the regulations or the laws come in. As you rightly point out, sometimes it becomes very difficult. They might have some kind of caveat which would allow the entities or organizations to go beyond 30 days, but that'll be an exception that they'll
Hmm.
work out in the
No,
law
I'm sure.
itself.
Yeah.
So the DFIR personnel would be in need. There would be content sets that would come in, rule sets that would be needed, possibly into the capabilities on the detection side, forensics, I'm sure, chain of custody and other things would definitely be playing a role there. So that's where I see this heading. I know these are very early days for this directive to be impacting us as individuals, especially in India for sure. But as
Yeah.
we are kind of globalized and work in service organization, product organizations to help customers all across the world, I think it's an important juncture for us to just get ahead and get knowing this directive and what's coming out.
Yeah, I think if you are listening to this podcast or anyone, my personal recommendation is if you've just started in cybersecurity, always read best practices, regulations. Nobody's telling you to go and implement. You'll not get. It's very hard to get those opportunities. But if you understand, if you go through this documentation, some of you could find it boring. I find it interesting now because it tells you about the best practices. Okay, and that can help you in your career. So I highly recommend that. Okay. Any advice, Vishwameet, from you on that?
Well, to be honest, when you start into cybersecurity and this is something coming from experience, most of the times we think of technology as being the be and end of it all. We start implementing, we start reading books which are related to technology. But what I realized at the end of it, if you want to make this simple and make this effective, you have to think about cybersecurity as a subject matter which applies to certain sort of loopholes, gaps that exist in different kinds of ecosystems. So until you understand those gaps conceptually, the application of technology um, is is not that effective. Is
Hmm.
it that doesn't give you that expertise, that efficiency um, to be working in organization. So um, the thought that you need to think and put into practice is that think about those gaps, think about what kinds of controls are needed for that gap, and then think about the technology. That's the
Hmm.
cascade
Yeah,
that one needs to build. And if you build this up early in your career, the better it is.
I absolutely agree on that. Okay. Anything else? Any last points, Vishwameet?
No, well, no,
From it?
nothing. I think it was wonderful to have this conversation, and thank you so much, Prashant, for sparing the hour.
No, thank you.
I
Thanks
hope.
to you. I learned a lot. Before this session, I knew about NIS2 because I've been reading about it, but this gave a good uh, template from essentially the first principle for me to start and reading about it, learning more about it, because I know this is going to impact us, everybody in cybersecurity, everybody in IT audit, more work, more opportunities for us to grow. So yeah, I'm gonna
Definitely.
start reading. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Great. No, thank you again, and have a good one. Take care.
You too.
Bye now.